There was a saying in the Drath Empire that had been around long enough that nobody remembered who first said it. It went something like this: some commanders win battles and some commanders are battles. The difference being that one kind could be replaced and the other kind could not. General Vira was the second kind. She had been commanding Drath forces since she was 24 years old, which was young by any military standards and almost unheard of by Drath standards, where rank was typically a thing you accumulated slowly over decades of careful service and careful politics and careful everything. Vira had not been careful. She had been effective, which it turned out was a different thing entirely and in most situations a better one. She had a mind that processed tactical situations the way other people processed simple arithmetic: fast, accurate, and without a lot of visible effort. She made decisions quickly and she made them well, and she did not spend time second-guessing them afterward, which is the quality that separates commanders who win from commanders who almost win. She had never lost a battle. Not one. In 14 years of active command across 4 different conflict zones, her record was clean in the way that very few records in the history of the Drath military had ever been clean. Her superiors found her useful and slightly uncomfortable to be around, which she had always considered an acceptable trait. But the thing that made Vira genuinely different from other Drath commanders, the thing that put her in a category that was essentially a category of one, was the Varak. Most people in the galaxy knew what a Varak was the same way they knew what a collapsing star was, by reputation from a safe distance, with the understanding that direct experience was something to be avoided. It was an apex predator in the truest sense of the phrase, meaning there was nothing in its natural environment that had ever successfully hunted it, and its natural environment covered a significant portion of one of the more hostile planets in the Drath's territorial range. It was roughly the size of a small building when fully grown. It had a sensory system so developed it could detect changes in another creature's biochemistry from several hundred meters away. It was fast in a way that seemed wrong for something that large. The way watching it move always created a brief moment of disbelief in the observer before the more practical emotion of fear took over. The Drath military had been attempting to use Varaks as weapons for over a century. The results had been mixed in the way that results are mixed when the thing you are trying to weaponize is significantly more intelligent than you initially assumed and not particularly interested in cooperating. Bonding a Varak to a handler required a neural link, a specific biological and technological process that connected the handler's nervous system to the Varak's sensory network, creating a channel of communication that went both ways. The Varak could feel the handler's intentions. The handler could feel the Varak's responses. Done properly, over time, it created something that was less like control and more like a working understanding between 2 very different kinds of mind. Most handlers spent 3 to 5 years developing a functional bond. Some never managed it at all. A few managed a partial bond that worked well enough in controlled conditions and fell apart under pressure, which was the worst possible outcome given what they were working with. Vira had achieved a full bond in 8 months. Her science team had studied this extensively and had produced a long report that said, essentially, that they didn't fully understand why. Vira had read the report, noted their conclusion and moved on. She was not especially interested in why. She was interested in results, and the result was that she and the Varak functioned together with a precision and fluency that no other handler-Varak pair in Drath history had come close to matching. The Varak was not a pet. She had never made that mistake. It was not a tool either, exactly, though it functioned as one when she needed it to. It was more like a partner that operated on entirely different terms than any partner she had worked with before. One that communicated in sensation rather than language, in impulse rather than argument, and that had its own perspective on every situation even when it ultimately deferred to hers. She had used it in combat 14 times over 6 years. 14 times, 14 outcomes that ended the way she needed them to end. The Varak was fast and it was precise when she directed it, and it had never once failed to complete what she sent it to do. She had no reason to expect the 15th time to be different. The perimeter breach came through on a Tuesday, which was otherwise an unremarkable day. The alert was minor, a single contact, moving slowly, coming from the eastern edge of the secured zone where the terrain was rough enough that the automated sensors had a slightly wider margin of error than she liked. She pulled up the surveillance feed on the panel in her command room and looked at it. A human soldier. Walking. Not running, not crouching, not moving with any of the deliberate carefulness of someone on an infiltration operation. Just walking the way a person walks when they are trying to figure out where they are. He had no helmet on. She could see his face clearly on the feed, a man somewhere in his 30s, with the look of someone who was genuinely trying to get his bearings and was not having much success. No visible weapons. No equipment beyond standard field gear. No backup visible in any direction that her sensors could reach. She watched him for 30 seconds. He stopped once, looked around, checked something on his wrist, a compass or a navigation device of some kind, and then kept walking in the same direction, which was directly deeper into her secured perimeter. 30 seconds was enough. She had made faster calls on less information many times. She reached through the neural link and sent the Varrock. The sensation of sending it was something she had never been able to describe adequately to anyone who asked. It wasn't like giving an order in the conventional sense. It was more like shifting her own intention and feeling the Varrock pick it up the way a large ship picks up a current. A change of direction that started from something felt rather than something said. She felt it move. She felt the ground through its feet, the air moving around its body, the landscape it was crossing in the fast and utterly silent way it moved when it was focused. She kept watching the feed. She saw the moment the human heard it coming. He stopped walking and turned his head, and there was a brief moment where his body language shifted in the specific way that human bodies shift when they register that something large is approaching from a direction they can't fully see yet. He did not run. She noted this with mild professional interest. Most did. The Varrock came through the tree line at the edge of the feed's frame. Full size, full speed, the particular kind of presence it carried when it was fully engaged, which was the kind of presence that tended to make everything else in the immediate environment feel very small and very temporary. The human looked at it. The Varrock covered the remaining distance in seconds. And then it stopped. Not slowed down gradually. Stopped. The way something stops when a decision has been made, clear and complete, with no ambiguity about it. It stood in front of the human at a distance of maybe 3 meters, and Vyra felt through the neural link a sensation she had never felt from it before in 6 years of connection. Not aggression, not the focused readiness it carried when it was completing a task. Something else. Something quieter and more complicated that she didn't have a word for. The Varrock lowered its head. All the way down. Slowly and deliberately, the massive head descending until it was nearly at the level of the human's waist, held there in a position that Vyra recognized because she had seen it directed at herself. Only at herself. In 6 years, only ever at herself. It was the closest thing the Varrock had to a bow. The human stood completely still for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out one hand and placed it on the side of the Varrock's head. Vyra stared at the surveillance feed. In her 14 years of command across 4 conflict zones, with a record that had never once included the word loss in any of its entries, she had never once stared at a surveillance feed the way she was staring at it right now. She stared at it for a long time. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform out of habit, and went to go see this for herself. Vyra had 4 officers in her command room when the feed showed the Varrock bow. She watched their faces for exactly the amount of time it took her to conclude that none of them were going to be useful in the next hour. They had the look that people get when reality has presented them with something that doesn't fit any of the boxes they have available. A kind of suspended blankness like a loading screen on a device that has been asked to run something it wasn't built for. One of them actually opened his mouth and then closed it again without producing anything. Another was leaning toward the feed panel with the expression of someone who believed that looking more closely at something confusing would eventually make it less confusing. Vyra had no patience for any of it. She was already moving toward the door when she said, over her shoulder, that nobody was to approach the eastern perimeter until she said otherwise, that nobody was to contact the Varrock through any secondary channel, and that if anyone did either of those things while she was gone she would deal with that separately when she returned. She said it in the flat and final tone that her officers had learned over the years meant the conversation was over before it started. Then she walked out. She took a weapons check out of habit rather than specific concern. Sidearm confirmed, secondary confirmed, the small close-range unit on her left forearm that most people didn't know about until it was relevant. She was not afraid of the human. A single unarmed soldier wandering around in her perimeter was not a threat profile she needed to prepare for in any serious way. The weapon was just who she was. She carried it the way other people carried certain habits. Not because every situation required it but because being without it felt incomplete. The walk from the command building to the eastern perimeter took about 8 minutes at a normal pace. Vyra did it in 6 without appearing to rush, which was a skill she had developed early in her career because she had learned that how a commander moved through a space told everyone watching something about how the commander felt about the situation, and she had a strict policy about what she allowed her body language to communicate. She heard the Varrock before she saw it. The low resonant sound it was making carried through the trees in the particular way that low sounds carry, not loud but present, felt as much as heard, the kind of frequency that registered somewhere below conscious thought and slightly above instinct. She had heard it many times. It was not a sound the Varrock made often. It was not a sound she had ever heard it direct at anything other than her. She came through the tree line and stopped. The human was standing exactly where the surveillance feed had shown him. Cool. She had pulled his basic identification from the military database on her comm during the walkover. A ground soldier, mid-level rank, assigned to a unit operating about 12 kilometers north of here. No particular distinctions on his record. No special operations background, no intelligence training, nothing that would explain any of this. His file read like the file of a competent and unremarkable soldier who had ended up somewhere he was not supposed to be, which was consistent with what she had seen on the feed and what she was looking at now. He had one hand resting on the side of the Varek's head. Not gripping, not pressing. Just resting, with the particular ease of someone who had put their hand on large animals many times before and had no physical memory of being afraid of the process. He was talking. She couldn't hear the words from this distance, just the tone, low and unhurried, the specific rhythm of someone having a one-sided conversation they were fully committed to regardless of whether the other party could respond in kind. The Varek's eyes were half closed. Vira stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at this for a moment. The Varek's eyes being half closed was something it did in exactly one context, and that context was when it was in her presence, connected through the neural link, in a state that her science team's report had described as something close to contentment. She had always found the word slightly inadequate but had not had a better one to offer. She stepped forward. Cole heard her. He turned his head without any sudden movement, the way someone turns when they've heard an approach and have already decided not to be alarmed by it. He looked at her with an expression that was open and slightly uncertain in the specific way of someone who knows they've ended up somewhere they shouldn't be and is trying to figure out the best way to address that. He nodded. A small, polite, entirely normal nod. Then he said in a conversational tone that suggested he had not fully registered the weapon she had drawn or had registered it and was choosing a response anyway, that he hoped he wasn't trespassing. He said it exactly the way a person says it when they have knocked on the wrong door in an apartment building and the neighbor who answered is looking at them with an expression that is less than welcoming. Slightly apologetic, slightly awkward, and containing a complete absence of the specific fear that every other living thing Vira had ever walked toward with a weapon in her hand had demonstrated within the first few seconds. She stopped walking. Not because she had decided to stop. Because the Varek had moved. It was a slow movement. Deliberate. The Varek shifted its body in the way that very large things shift when they want the shift to be noticed. Not aggressive, not sudden, just a repositioning that happened to place several tons of apex predator between Vira and the human in a way that was impossible to interpret as anything other than intentional. Vira looked at the Varek. The Varek looked at her with its half-closed eyes and continued making the low resonant sound. Through the neural link she felt something she had no good framework for. Not defiance. The Varek had never been defiant with her and this didn't feel like defiance. It felt more like a position statement. Like the Varek had assessed the situation and formed a view about it and was expressing that view in the only language it had, which was its body and the sound it was making and the fact that it was standing exactly where it was standing. Vira was a person who prided herself on clear thinking in unclear situations. She had built her entire career on it. She stood at the edge of the tree line with her weapon in her hand and her neural link open and the most dangerous creature in the Drath military arsenal positioned between her and an unarmed human who had just nodded at her like a neighbor, and she thought clearly about the situation. The clear thought was this: she had no idea what was happening. That was a thought she had not had in a very long time. She did not enjoy it. She lowered the weapon. Not put it away. Just lowered it because the Varek's position made raising it a statement she was not ready to make yet, and because the human was unarmed, and because she needed a moment to think and pointing a weapon at someone was not a posture that was good for thinking. Cole watched her lower it. His expression shifted slightly, not relief exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when a situation moves from one category to a slightly better one. He glanced at the Varek beside him, then back at Vira. He's been very calm, Cole said, in the tone of someone offering useful information. He patted the side of the Varek's head once, gently. Whatever he is, I've never seen anything like him. Vira looked at Cole. Then at the Varek. Then at Cole again. She said. Not he. Cole considered this briefly. Okay, he said, in the tone of someone who was not fully convinced but was willing to accept the correction for now. He looked at the Varek again with the expression of a person who has already formed an opinion and is being polite about it. Your has been very calm. The Varek made the low resonant sound slightly louder, which Vira had never heard it do before and which she had absolutely no entry for in any reference she had available. She stood in the trees on the eastern edge of her secured perimeter, 14 years of unbroken command record behind her, and looked at a human soldier who was having what appeared to be a perfectly comfortable moment with the most lethal creature in her arsenal. She put the weapon away. She did it slowly and without drama because she did not do things with drama. But she put it away because the Varrock was standing where it was standing, and because the situation was what the situation was, and because some moments require you to accept that the next step is a question rather than an answer. "How did you end up here?" she said. Cole glanced at his wrist navigation device. Then at the surrounding trees. Then back at her with the expression of a man who had been asking himself the same question for probably the last 40 minutes. "Honestly," he said, "I was hoping you could tell me." Vira looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, the Varrock settled its enormous weight more comfortably into the ground, closed its eyes slightly further, and continued its sound. Vira did not sleep that night. This was not particularly unusual for her. She had never been a heavy sleeper and had made a kind of peace with that over the years, treating the hours between late night and early morning as additional working time rather than failed rest. She was usually at her desk by the time the first shift officers arrived and had already been there for 2 hours. This had contributed significantly to her reputation as someone who was slightly more than human in her capacity for sustained focus, which she had never corrected because reputations of that kind were professionally useful. But this particular night was different from her usual sleeplessness. Usually when she was awake at 2 in the morning she was working on something specific. A tactical problem, a logistics issue, a personnel decision that needed more thought than the day had given her time for. Her mind was occupied and the occupation was productive, and the hours passed with a sense of forward movement even if forward was slow. Tonight her mind kept returning to the same image. The surveillance feed. The Varrock reaching the human, covering that distance in the fast and silent way it moved when it was fully engaged, arriving with all of that focused and considerable presence. And then stopping. And then the head going down. She had watched the recording 4 times since returning to the command building. The result was the same every time. She had no framework for it, and watching it again did not provide one. She needed answers from people who had frameworks she didn't. Her science team had 6 members. She assembled them at 6 in the morning, which was earlier than any of them would have chosen and which none of them said anything about because she was who she was. She laid out what had happened in plain and sequential terms, without editorializing, without expressing what she found strange about it. Though all 6 of them clearly found it strange because their faces did the same suspended thing her officers' faces had done the night before, and she waited for that to pass before continuing. She told them what she needed. A complete analysis of the human designated Cole. Biological, chemical, neurological, technological. She wanted to know what he was carrying, what he was producing, what he was emitting at any frequency or in any medium that could have produced the behavior she had documented. She wanted the analysis thorough, and she wanted it fast, and she wanted it presented to her without the kind of hedging and qualification that scientists sometimes wrapped their conclusions in when they weren't confident, because she needed to know what they actually found, not what they were comfortable saying they found. She gave them Cole's file, which was thin enough to read in 4 minutes and contained nothing that looked relevant. Then she arranged for Cole to be moved to the medical assessment area of the facility, which was more comfortable than the holding room he had been in overnight and which had the equipment her team needed. She also arranged, because it was necessary and because she had decided the previous evening that the situation required information more than it required protocol, for the Varrock to have access to the outer area adjacent to the medical wing. This was not a standard arrangement. There was no policy for it because the scenario it addressed had never come up before. Her facilities officer had looked at her when she issued the instruction with an expression that wanted to ask a question and then thought better of it. Good, Vira thought. Better that way. The science team worked for 2 full days. Vira gave them the time and did not stand over them while they used it, which required a specific kind of discipline on her part because her instinct was always to be in the room where information was being developed. She occupied herself with the facility's other operational demands, of which there were enough to fill the hours even if they didn't fill her attention the way they normally did. She reviewed patrol reports. She approved a maintenance schedule. She had 3 conversations with officers about things she processed on the surface while the deeper part of her mind stayed with the question she had handed to her science team. On the evening of the 2nd day, their lead researcher, a methodical woman named Dr. Voss, who communicated in the precise and careful way of someone who had spent 20 years making sure she was not misunderstood, sent a message saying the report was ready. Vira read it at her desk. Alone, which was how she preferred to receive information she didn't yet know how to react to. The first section covered everything they hadn't found. No chemical agents. No technological interference. No biological compounds that could be classified as deliberately produced or artificially introduced. Nothing in Cole's equipment, his clothing, his field gear, his wrist navigation device or anything else he had been carrying when he came through the perimeter. This section was long because the team had been thorough and because ruling things out completely required showing the work. Vira read through it at her normal pace, which was fast. She was looking for the turn, the point where the report shifted from what wasn't there to what was. It came on page 11. The neural frequency section. She slowed down here and read carefully. What the team had found, through a combination of neurological scanning and cross-reference data from the Varrock sensory system, was a resonance pattern. A specific combination of low-frequency neural signals that Cole's nervous system was producing passively, not consciously, not deliberately, just as a natural function of his biology in a calm state. The pattern itself was not unique to Cole. It was something humans produced generally, apparently, under certain conditions. The particular version Cole produced was shaped and reinforced by something in his history that had left a biological mark on his nervous system. 10 years of working with large animals. The official classification in the facility's records listed Cole as a detained enemy combatant pending processing. This was the correct classification under draft military protocol for a foreign soldier found inside a secured perimeter during an active conflict period. The protocol was clear about what came next: formal interrogation, intelligence assessment, transfer to a holding facility at the appropriate security level, and eventual processing through whatever exchange or containment arrangement the current state of the conflict made available. Vira had written the classification herself. It was accurate and it was proper and it sat in the system the way correct paperwork sits, filed, logged, technically satisfying every requirement. What it did not account for was the Varrock. The Varrock had its own view of the arrangement and the arrangement it had arrived at was simple. Cole was where the Varrock was. This was not a complex position. It did not involve nuance or qualification. Wherever Cole went within the facility, the Varrock was nearby. Not aggressive about it. Not dramatic. Just present, in the patient and absolute way that very large creatures are present when they have decided something. It waited outside whatever room Cole was in. When Cole was moved between areas, it tracked the movement with the focused attention it usually reserved for things Vira had directed it to watch. When Cole was in the outer yard for the hour of outside time she had, perhaps unwisely but practically, decided to allow, the Varrock was in the adjacent area with its head resting on the partition wall at a height that put it roughly level with Cole's shoulder. Cole talked to it during those hours. Vira had seen this on the facility cameras. Not the performed kind of talking that people sometimes did with animals when they knew they were being watched. Look how comfortable I am, look how connected we are. Just actual talking. The low, unhurried kind. The kind that didn't require a response to feel complete. He talked about whatever he was thinking about, apparently. She had reviewed the audio once and found him explaining, in a calm and detailed way, the migratory patterns of a large herd animal from a region on Earth she had never heard of, for no discernible reason except that it was what was in his head and the Varrock seemed content to receive it. The Varrock's eyes had been half closed for the entire recording. Vira had a decision to make and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had been circling it for 3 days without landing. The protocol said one thing. The situation said another. And the Varrock, which had never in 6 years of bonded partnership expressed anything she would describe as a preference about how she handled her work, was expressing something now that was difficult to categorize as anything other than a preference. She could override it. She had the authority and the means and she had overridden more complicated situations than this in her career. The Varrock was bonded to her and the bond was real and functional and she could use it to communicate clearly and firmly that the current arrangement was not going to continue. She thought about doing this for a while. She thought about it the way she thought about tactical problems, from multiple angles, considering the variables, mapping the likely outcomes. The outcome she kept arriving at was that forcing the issue would damage something. Not the bond necessarily, or not only the bond. Something else. Something she didn't have a precise word for but that felt, when she thought about it honestly, like it mattered more than the protocol did. So she went to talk to Cole instead. The first conversation was short. She told herself it was practical. She needed to understand the human side of what her science team had documented, and Cole was the only available source. This was true enough to use as a reason. She found him in the outer yard during his hour outside. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the partition wall and the Varrock's enormous head resting approximately 18 inches from his left shoulder, and he was doing nothing in particular, which Vira had observed was something Cole was considerably better at than most people she had worked with. Just sitting. Watching the sky. Existing in the space without feeling the need to do anything with it. He looked up when she approached. He had the particular alertness of someone who was always aware of their surroundings without appearing to perform that awareness, which she recognized as a quality that came from years of working in environments where what you didn't notice could make the situation considerably worse. She sat down. Not close but not at a distance that was designed to communicate anything. Just sat on a low barrier across from where he was, and looked at the Varrock for a moment. My science team produced a report, she said. Okay, Cole said. About you. About what you carry biologically. About why it responded the way it did. Cole looked at the Varrock. Then back at her. What did they find? She told him. Plainly, without softening it or building toward it. The neural frequencies, the resonance pattern, the decade of wildlife handling that had shaped his nervous system in ways that the Varrock sensory system had apparently found significant. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, in order, clearly, without decoration. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ha." She waited. "So I didn't do anything," he said. "It just felt something." "Correct." He looked at the Varrock again. The Varrock looked back at him with its half-closed eyes. "What did it feel exactly?" "In the report." "The word they used was resonant," Vira said. "Your pattern matched something in its sensory framework that it categorizes as," she paused slightly because the next word still felt slightly strange coming from her in this context, "safe." Cole nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. Not in a surprised way. In the way of someone hearing a confirmation of something they had already half understood. Animals that size, predators especially, they pick up on things we don't have instruments for half the time. They're reading you constantly. Your breathing, your heart rate, the way your muscles are holding. 10 years of working with animals like that, you stop producing the signals that read as threat. Your body just learns. Vira looked at him. "You understood this before the report." "I understood the animal side of it," he said. "Not the specifics. Just that it felt comfortable and I felt comfortable, and those two things were probably related." He paused. "It's a pretty good feeling for the record. When something that size decides you're okay." Vira said nothing for a moment. She looked at the Varrock. She thought about the neural link and what she felt through it when the bond was fully open. The Varrock sensory world, vast and detailed and operating on frequencies she could feel but not fully translate. She had spent 6 years learning to read it. Cole had walked in and produced something it read as familiar in under a minute. "You worked with animals for 10 years, she said. "Before the military." "Wildlife handling," Cole said. "Large predators mostly. Bears, big cats, a few things that don't have common names because they're not common. Started when I was 19. Did it until I was 29 and then?" He made a small gesture that covered whatever the rest of that sentence was. "Different direction." "Why?" He was quiet for a second. Not the quiet of someone deciding what to say. The quiet of someone who knows what they want to say and is checking whether they want to say it. "Felt like I was needed somewhere else," he said finally. Simply, without asking her to find it meaningful. She didn't push it. She filed it and moved on. The conversation shifted to the Varrock. She asked what he had noticed from his side in the first moment. He described it in the specific and observational way he described most things, what the Varrock's body language had communicated, the approach speed and what the change in that speed had told him, the head position when it stopped and what that typically indicated in large predatory animals operating on instinct. He was precise in a way she had not expected. Not military precise, where precision was taught and reinforced until it became mechanical. A different kind, the precision of someone who had learned to be accurate because inaccuracy in his previous work had real and immediate consequences. She found herself asking follow-up questions. The hour ended. She stood up. Cole stood up, which the Varrock tracked with the alert and gentle attention of something making sure a situation was fine before relaxing again. She walked back toward the command building. She was 3 steps away when Cole said, without any particular weight behind it, that the Varrock was going to miss her when she left. She stopped. Turned slightly. "It's bonded to me," she said. "Through a neural link." "I know," Cole said. "I just meant, it notices when you're here. Different from when you're not." He paused. "That's all." She turned back and kept walking. She sat at her desk for 20 minutes before she opened anything work-related. She spent those 20 minutes thinking about the difference between control and connection, which was a distinction Cole had drawn during the conversation in the casual way he drew most distinctions, as if he was just saying a thing that was obvious rather than a thing she had not heard articulated quite that way before. The next day she came back. Same time, same outer yard. She told herself again that it was practical. There was more information to gather. The report had raised questions that required follow-up. Both of these things were true. She sat down. Cole was already there, in the same position against the partition wall, the Varric in the same position beside him. He looked up with the same expression he always had, open, alert, not performing anything. Same time as yesterday, he said, not quite a question. I had follow-up questions, she said. Sure, he said in the tone of someone who accepted this completely and had no interest in saying otherwise. The Varric made the low resonant sound. Vyra ignored the sound the way she had been ignoring it. She was getting less successful at this as the days went on, which was something she noted and did not mention to anyone. Her officers had started exchanging looks when she left the command building at the same time each afternoon. She had noticed the looks. She had the kind of awareness of her environment that noticed everything. She ignored the looks completely. She was good at that when she needed to be. She sat down across from Cole and asked her follow-up question, which was about the difference between an animal that obeyed and an animal that chose, and whether in his experience that difference was always visible from the outside or whether it sometimes only became clear later. Cole thought about it for a moment. Then he answered, and she listened, and the afternoon moved forward in the way afternoons move when the conversation in them is the kind you don't notice the time passing inside of until it's already gone. The war did not end dramatically. That was the thing nobody told you about the endings of large and complicated conflicts. They rarely finished the way they started. They started with noise and speed and the kind of momentum that feels, from the inside, like it could go on forever. They ended slowly, in rooms, around tables, with people who were tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, sitting across from other people who were equally tired and equally done, working through language and terms and the careful architecture of agreements that both sides could accept without losing something they couldn't afford to lose. It took 14 months from the point where the first serious backchannel communication happened to the point where anything resembling a real negotiation began. Another 4 months after that before the table was set in any meaningful sense. And then 3 more months of the actual process, which was slow and frequently difficult and twice came close to falling apart completely before it didn't. Vyra was at the table for all of it. This had not been the original plan. The original plan had involved senior diplomatic staff, career negotiators, people whose entire professional identity was built around this kind of work. Vyra was a military commander. Her job was defined by a different set of skills and a different set of outcomes, and putting her at a negotiating table was not the obvious move for anyone's playbook. But something had shifted in the 14 months between Cole walking into her perimeter and the first session beginning. Something that was hard to quantify in the formal language of military and diplomatic reporting, but that was real and that people on both sides of the conflict had noticed and talked about in the indirect way that people talk about things they can observe but not fully explain. Vyra had become someone the humans would talk to. Not because she had softened. She had not softened. She was still who she had always been, direct, precise, entirely unbothered by discomfort and entirely unwilling to perform warmth she didn't feel. The humans at the early backchannel sessions had not found her easy. They had found her honest, which turned out to be more valuable in that context than easy would have been. She said what she meant. She did not say things she didn't mean. She did not walk away from difficult points or use language to obscure positions she was unwilling to defend openly. She sat with the hard parts of the conversation and worked through them rather than around them. Human negotiators, who had spent years dealing with draft counterparts who were skilled at the kind of elaborate diplomatic maneuvering that produced the appearance of progress without its substance, found this disorienting at first and then found it, cautiously and incrementally, something they could work with. Trust in negotiation is not a feeling. It is a track record. It accumulates in small moments. The moment you say a thing will not happen and it does not happen, the moment you acknowledge a point the other side is making instead of deflecting it, the moment you stay at the table when leaving would be easier. Vyra accumulated it the way she accumulated most things, methodically, without performing the process, just doing the work and letting the record speak. Cole was on the human side of the table. This was also not the original plan and was, if anything, even less of an obvious move than Vyra's presence. A mid-level ground soldier with a wildlife handling background was not a standard profile for a diplomatic delegation. The people who put him there knew something that didn't fit neatly into the official reasoning, which was that Cole had a specific and documented history of sitting across from Vyra and talking in a way that both of them came away from having actually communicated something real. In a process where real communication was the rarest and most valuable resource available, that history was worth more than a title. He was listed in the official delegation documents as a cultural liaison, which was a category broad enough to cover almost anything and specific enough to sound like it meant something. Cole had looked at the title on his credentials, looked at the person who handed them to him, and said okay in the way he said most things, without drama, without asking for more explanation than was necessary, just accepting the reality of the situation and moving forward into it. He was good at the table. Not in the way trained diplomats are good. He didn't have the vocabulary or the formal technique. He was good in the way that people are good when they have spent years learning to read living things and respond to what is actually there rather than what they expected to find. He noticed when a session was close to breaking down before it showed in anyone's words. He noticed when a point that seemed minor was actually carrying significant weight for the other side. He had a way of asking questions that were plainly honest rather than strategically constructed, and plainly honest questions in that environment had a way of cutting through things that elaborate ones couldn't. He and Vira did not sit on the same side of the table. They were on opposite sides of a conflict, and that was real, and neither of them pretended it wasn't. But there was something between them that the other people in the room noticed without being able to fully name. A kind of fluency, the ease of people who had learned each other's actual language rather than the formal version of it. When a session hit a wall, which happened regularly, the moments that moved things forward often involved one of them saying something to the other that was direct enough to cut through the accumulated layers of careful positioning that had built up around the stuck point. They never discussed this between sessions. They didn't need to. The agreement was signed on a Thursday. Vira remembered this detail later, not because Thursday was significant but because she had always had a precise memory for the incidental details of important moments. The day of the week, what the light was like, small irrelevant things that attached themselves to significant ones and stayed. The room was quiet when it was done. The kind of quiet that follows something large. Not celebratory, not relieved exactly, just the particular stillness of a moment that everyone present understands is real and permanent in a way the moments before were not. Vira signed her name in the place indicated. Cole signed his, across the table, in the slightly imprecise handwriting she had seen once before on a facility log he had filled out and that she had noticed at the time without knowing why. They did not shake hands or make eye contact across the table in the significant way that films later depicted these moments. They just signed, and it was done, and the room began the slow process of people beginning to move and speak again after a long stillness. The questions from her superiors came later. Formally, in the structured way that draft military culture processed outcomes that required explanation. The central question was simple. Why had she kept the human alive and operational within her facility rather than processing him through standard protocol, which would have resulted in transfer and eventually whatever exchange or containment the conflict's terms had produced? It was a fair question. She had thought about how to answer it many times before it was formally asked, knowing it was coming. She had considered several answers. The tactical one, that Cole's biological effect on the Varrock represented a phenomenon worth studying before removing the subject. This was true and would have been accepted. She had considered the intelligence angle, that a human soldier found deep in a secured perimeter without obvious infiltration equipment represented an anomaly worth extended investigation. Also true. Also acceptable. She gave neither of those answers. She told them that the Varrock had recognized something in the human that warranted attention. That she had investigated what was recognized and found it to be real. And that she had made the judgment call, based on 6 years of working with a creature whose sensory capabilities significantly exceeded her own, that when the Varrock identified something worth recognizing it was worth her time to understand what that something was. She told them that it usually knew things she didn't. She told them it had been right about this. Her superiors sat with this answer. It was not the kind of answer that fit neatly into formal reporting categories. One of them asked whether she was saying she had made a major operational decision based on the response of an animal. She said she was saying she had made it based on evidence. The fact that the evidence came through the Varrock sensory system rather than a conventional instrument didn't change its validity. The Varrock had been detecting things she couldn't detect for 6 years. She had learned to take that seriously. The meeting ended without full resolution, which meant they accepted it without officially accepting it, which was how draft military bureaucracy handled outcomes that were correct but inconvenient to formally acknowledge. Vira returned to her office and sat for a while. She thought about the surveillance feed. The Varrock reaching the human. The stop. The head going down. The moment she had watched 4 times trying to find a framework for it and had eventually given up on finding a framework and decided to go see it herself instead. She thought about a conversation from the early days in the facility yard, when Cole had said that the Varrock noticed when she was present and that it was different from when she wasn't. She had walked away from that without responding. She had thought about it more times since than she would have admitted to anyone. The Varrock was outside. It was always somewhere she could find it through the link, a presence at the edge of her awareness the way a compass point is always north regardless of which direction you're facing. She felt it now, settled, calm, The low resonant frequency it produced in its resting state that had become so familiar over 6 years that she noticed it most on the rare occasions it wasn't there. She reached through the link the way she did sometimes when there was nothing specific to communicate but the connection itself felt worth maintaining. The Varric received it and returned something. Not a thought, nothing that precise, just a warmth that moved through the link in both directions and that she had never found a good word for in any language she spoke. She sat with that for a while. 14 months ago a lost human soldier had walked into her perimeter and a creature that had never once failed to do what she directed it to do had stopped and put its head down and chosen something different. And that moment, that single moment on a surveillance feed that she had watched 4 times looking for an explanation, had pulled behind it a chain of events that had ended a war. Not because it was planned. Not because anyone had been strategic about it. Just because a creature with better senses than hers had recognized something worth recognizing, and she had been honest enough with herself to follow that recognition somewhere she hadn't expected to go. She looked at the wall of her office for a long time. At nothing in particular. Just sitting with the fact of it. The whole improbable chain of it. A database error, a dead navigation record, a wrong turn, a bow. The Varric usually knew things she didn't. She had always been smart enough to listen when it did. That, in the end, was the whole story. And it was enough.